This is a story that very few people know, and we're sure that many, after hearing it, will wonder if it's really possible that it's all true. Let's get to the question. Everything you'll hear today is historically documented, and more. If you stay with us until the end, you'll find out why that story, which began a century ago, also concerns our present. To understand the Soviet space race and its darker, more mystical side, we have to start from an episode that at first glance seems to have nothing to do with space. The embalming of Vladimir Lenin's body, the undisputed leader of the October Revolution. An event that took place in plain sight, but which hides a way of thinking, believing, and acting that is profoundly different from what official history has told us. But before we begin what will be an especially extraordinary and surprising journey today, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support our work and to not miss the upcoming videos. When Lenin died on January 21, 1924, the Soviet Union remained a fragile experiment. The man who had led the revolution was gone, and with him, the myth of socialism also risked dying. For days, an immense crowd, over 1 million people, marched through the streets of Moscow to see his body. Many cried while others sat silently as if hypnotized. At that point, Leonid Kreysin, an engineer and party insider, suggested an idea that seemed absurd for an atheist materialist regime, yet it was still accepted: to preserve Lenin's body forever. At first, they considered a temporary solution. They tried refrigeration techniques imported from Germany, but the body began to decompose. Two scientists, Vladimir Vorobev and Boris Zbarsky, accomplished the impossible by creating a chemical formula that preserves tissues indefinitely. Lenin was embalmed. His body was placed in a glass sarcophagus in the center of Red Square, and even today, a century later, it still lies there intact. But why did Soviet scientists dedicate themselves so intensely to this embalming? What did all this have to do with socialism, with atheist materialism? The official story speaks of a political cult created to celebrate the founder of the revolution, a cult that would later be replicated with Stalin, with Dimitrov in Bulgaria, Gottwald in Czechoslovakia, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Mao Zedong in China, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il in North Korea. Yet Lenin himself had explicitly requested that nothing of the sort be done. He feared becoming a symbol or idol. So why was his body embalmed with such obsession? Was it really a political act or something deeper? Disturbing clues emerge from documents of the time. Kreysin, in a letter from 1924, wrote, or perhaps prophesied,
"Progress will eventually allow Lenin to be brought back to life."
So it wasn't just a symbolic gesture, but an experiment. An experiment that, as we will see, was not limited to this, but led the Soviet Union into space. But to better understand all this, we need to take another step back into the past. Long before Lenin, long before Sputnik, in Tsarist Russia at the end of the 19th century, a solitary man had already imagined it all. His name was Nikolai Fedorov. Fedorov was neither a politician nor a scientist in the modern sense of the word. He was a self-taught Christian philosopher who spent his days in the silent corridors of the Moscow library, where he worked as a librarian. There, surrounded by sacred and scientific texts, he developed a vision that would quietly but profoundly shape the history of Russian science. A philosophy that combined religion and technology, mysticism and rationality. For Fedorov, science was not just a tool for knowledge, but an act of redemption. He believed God had entrusted man to continue and complete creation. If man was made in God's image and likeness, he had to become divine. If death was the universe's greatest injustice, man had a moral duty to defeat it for everyone, not just himself. In his works, Fedorov wrote that every scientific progress, every discovery, had to be aimed at resurrecting the dead. Not metaphorically, but literally. The living were responsible for reviving past generations. It was cosmic justice. Only by reviving their fathers could humanity be redeemed. In this vision, science serves as a new tool for the sacred. The universe was seen as a living organism animated by a divine principle, and man was its priest. Few embraced Fedorov's ideas, but one young scientist among them would change history. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, mathematician, inventor, and visionary, was one of his most devoted disciples. With him, the Cosmism vision moves from Earth to the sky, because such a grand plan required an answer to a terribly practical question. Where do you put billions of resurrected human beings? The Earth wouldn't have been enough. Here, Fedorov, and especially Tsiolkovsky, looked to the sky, the moon, the brightest star. It wasn't seen as a dead rock to be conquered, but as the first sacred laboratory for the expansion of life. It was the first step to make the cosmos a garden, the first off-world ark for the resurrected fathers. In his writings, Fedorov's metaphysical visions turned into equations, formulas, and concrete projects. He was the first to calculate the trajectory of a multi-stage rocket. He said the Earth is humanity's cradle, but we can't stay in a cradle forever. Few realize that, for Tsiolkovsky, that phrase wasn't about technical progress, but a statement of faith. Because man, he said, has the task of bringing life into the universe, of spreading it beyond the boundaries of the Earth. He saw the cosmos not as empty space to conquer, but as a spiritual field to cultivate. Each rocket, experiment, and step skyward was part of a bigger plan to divinize matter. Some modern scholars say the moon was both a scientific goal and a sacred symbol, the first cosmic life laboratory for the first cosmists. In this vision, the colonization of space was not a material conquest, but an act of spiritual continuity, an attempt to extend creation itself. A small group of thinkers, scientists, and philosophers formed around these ideas, later known as cosmists. They were physicists, astronomers, theologians, politicians, and doctors. They believed that science should merge with ethics and faith, and that humanity's destiny was to become an active part of the evolution of the cosmos. And so, already at the beginning of the 20th century, long before the October Revolution, the idea of overcoming death and colonizing space had already been born in Russia, but not as a political project, but as a spiritual mission. But with the advent of socialism, everything changed. The openly religious roots of Cosmism were repressed and its language was purged. Yet that way of thinking did not disappear. It survived like an underground river, influencing Russian scientific culture. His most radical ideas, like the resurrection of the dead, were set aside, but his utopian ambition was absorbed and transformed by the state ideology. Officially, the Soviet Union denied the soul and God. Yet paradoxically, state atheism took on an almost religious mission. Use science and technology to create a new human, control nature, and aim for a perfect future. It was the Cosmism dream, stripped of its God and clothed in dialectical materialism. And it was precisely from that dream, from that faith disguised as science, that the greatest technological endeavor of modern history was born, the space race. After the Soviet Union emerged from World War II, it was clear that science was no longer just knowledge, it was power. The socialist state, based on materialism, claimed it had eliminated all forms of faith. Yet the thinking of the cosmists had not disappeared. Part of it had been absorbed and adapted, and part of it was being passed down quietly. Many scientists in labs and academies grew up reading Tsiolkovsky and Vernadsky. They could not use terms like resurrection or soul, as the regime wouldn't tolerate them. But they coined new ones like vital energy, collective consciousness, cosmic evolution of man. The principles of that ancient faith were passed down cryptically. Thus, the 19th century philosopher's dream merged with the 20th century political machine. The common work of Fedorov, which was meant to unite humanity, became the universal mission of socialism, to lead man toward perfection, to control nature, and to bend time. The living symbol of this transformation was Sergei Korolyov, the brilliant engineer who would lead the Soviet Union into space. Korolyov had studied the works of Tsiolkovsky and admired him deeply, calling him the prophet of the cosmos. In his hands, Tsiolkovsky's visionary legacy merged with the pragmatic needs of the Cold War. The Cosmism philosophy provided a powerful imagery and a cultural horizon, but it was the military competition with America that turned those visions into a project, calculation and technology. In 1957, the R-7 rocket launched Sputnik 1 into orbit from Baikonur's secret base, a metal object as big as a sphere which emitted a simple radio signal. Yet that beep-beep that crossed the sky was perceived as a signal of power, but also of transcendence. For the first time, man had touched the sky with his own hands. A few years later, on April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin performed the final act of that metamorphosis. He was the first man to orbit the Earth. He was celebrated as a hero worldwide, while at home his smiling face became almost a religious icon. Gagarin likely wasn't a Cosmism follower, but his achievement reflected their core vision. He was the symbol of man rising above the Earth, looking down at the planet and discovering its fragility. And his words, which became famous, seemed almost to echo, consciously or not, that powerful underlying thought. From up here, the Earth is beautiful with no borders or boundaries. Words that, for the cosmos, had a specific meaning. Man was realizing he was part of something larger, a single living organism, Earth itself, a sign that humanity was starting to see itself as part of the whole. But these were just the first steps. The ultimate goal? Korolyov's obsession was the moon. While the world celebrated the first cosmonauts, in the darkest state secrets, the most ambitious and ill-fated project in history was taking shape. The N1L3 lunar program. Korolyov designed a massive rocket over 100 meters tall to land a cosmonaut on the moon before the Americans. It was the materialization of the cosmist's dream. However, the project suffered from bad luck, internal conflict, and most of all, dangerous haste. The rocket had 4 test launches between 1969 and 1972, all ended in catastrophic explosions, some of which were among the most powerful non-nuclear detonations in history. The program was such a disaster that the Soviet Union denied it existed for decades, erasing it from official history. The Cosmism ideal, viewing science as universal love, was transformed into its opposite, because it was precisely war, the arms race, and the fear of destruction that became the driving force of progress. Humanity, the cosmists said, could not rise as long as it remained divided. As long as men fought each other, mankind's cosmic destiny would remain blocked. And yet it was precisely competition, rivalry, and mutual suspicion between superpowers that pushed the human species toward the sky. The cosmists' idea of universal union was achieved under threat of annihilation. The rockets that sent humans to orbit also built nuclear missiles targeting others. So while the cosmist idea of universal union was taking shape in space missions, the world, paradoxically, had never been so divided.
As long as men fight each other, they cannot ascend to the sky together.
But this was not the only price to pay. Between 1945 and 1961, the Soviet Union conducted over 100 experimental launches. Many failed, often with tragic consequences. On October 24, 1960, a gigantic explosion at the Baikonur base killed 126 people. It was the worst catastrophe in Soviet space history, kept secret for 30 years. According to the regime, those deaths weren't tragedies, but necessary sacrifices for progress. For the cosmists, however, it was an indelible debt that humanity owed to these men, a debt that would one day be redeemed with their resurrection. In July 1969, while the remains of the Soviet lunar rocket were still burning in the Kazakh steppe after an apocalyptic explosion, the world witnessed an event that seemed to change history forever. The images sent by National Aeronautics and Space Administration showed Apollo 11 touching down on the lunar surface. These images marked not only the end of a race, but the triumph of one worldview over another. The American vision, pragmatic and political, was manifested in powerful images showing National Aeronautics and Space Administration astronauts planting a flag on the lunar surface. The moon became a symbolic conquest and a frontier to be claimed. The Soviet vision, born from the Cosmism dream, was radically different. Their secret plan was not only to arrive, but to stay. It included the construction of a permanent lunar base, Zvezda, the first outpost of humanity in the cosmos. The American flag on the gray soil marked not just a technological victory, but also the end of a far greater dream. That clash on the lunar surface simply reflected two opposing beliefs that had vied for humanity's future for a century. After the failure of the Soviet lunar missions, the dream of colonizing space changed form. No longer a race to reach the moon, but missions that were less spectacular, quieter, yet still carried within them the Cosmism spirit. Not to conquer the sky, but to live in it. In 1986, the Soviets created Mir, the first permanent space station in history. For the first time, man was not just visiting space, he was living there. That huge metal structure above Earth was humanity's first stable outpost in space. The realization of what Fedorov and Tsiolkovsky had dreamed of a century earlier, to sow life among the stars. Then, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Mir gave way to the International Space Station, that legacy survived. The heart of the Russian segment was, not by chance, named after the old lunar base project, Zvezda. And right there in the Zvezda module, something unusual and little known happens. Sacred icons float among control panels, cables, and scientific instruments. Cosmonauts brought images of the Madonna of Kazan, Saint Nicholas, and Saint Sergius of Radonej, blessed on Earth into space. But why do images like these find a place in one of the most scientifically advanced places, a symbol of secular and humanist culture? A superficial reading would dismiss them as mere folklore, but those who look deeper recognize in them a powerful and silent sign of continuity. Why in the Zvezda module, silent heir of the Cosmism dream, faith and science still coexist, intertwined in an ancient tradition that, like an underground river, continues secretly to guide the intentions behind the conquest of space. Russian Cosmism, despite the moon defeat, remained a spiritual tradition envisioning humans as collaborators in a divine plan. On the other hand, the Western vision, born from the Enlightenment and materialism, which would later lead to the birth of transhumanism, the idea that man through science can remake himself. Although today's Russia may seem very different from that era, those ideas have never completely disappeared. In recent years, Cosmism has once again been studied, reprinted, discussed in universities, and even invoked in some official ceremonies. The works of Fedorov and Tsiolkovsky are now considered an integral part of national culture. Certain political speeches revive words that echo ancient visions: man as creator, science as the path to immortality. It's as if, beneath the surface of contemporary Russia, that dream continues to beat. Different, maybe distorted, but alive. It shows that dream never truly disappeared. In September 2025, during the military parade in Beijing, something surprising happens. A microphone accidentally left on picks up a conversation between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Their words, recorded and then removed from official media, spoke of longevity, organ transplants, and immortality.
Human organs can be transplanted continuously. The longer you live, the younger you become. Maybe you can even achieve immortality.
Some scientists predict that in this century, humans will be able to live up to 150 years.
A century later in the Western world, another philosophy used similar language but with opposite meanings. Transhumanism was born, not a continuation of Cosmism, but its mirror image, stripped of the divine and guided by technology. The term was coined in 1957 by biologist Julian Huxley, who wrote,
Man must surpass himself through science.
A concept fully aligned with the Western evolutionary, pragmatic, and competitive mindset, a vision that now dominates our era. In the laboratories of Silicon Valley, in fact, they talk about digital immortality, consciousness uploading, and radical longevity. Elon Musk is designing neural interfaces to merge brain and machine. Ray Kurzweil predicts that by 2045, humans will be immortal thanks to technology. Sam Altman funds companies that freeze the human body to bring it back to life in the future. All of these are real, documented, and publicly announced ideas. But behind these promises, there isn't the compassion of the cosmists, but rather a new cult of survival. Cosmism stems from faith in life, while transhumanism arises from fear of death. One wanted to redeem the universe, the other wants to escape it. Fedorov envisioned resurrection for everyone, while transhumanism offers immortality to a select few, a new digital eugenics where salvation is not a gift, but a privilege. More than a century later, the two faiths still confront each other. Cosmism, which looks to the sky and sees a design to be completed, and transhumanism, which sees space as a place to be conquered. Both dream of defeating death, but for the cosmists, man is the instrument of the divine, while for the transhumanists, he is its replacement. And so, after a century of science, rockets, and artificial intelligence, the answer to a question remains unresolved. If humans are merely products of evolution, matter that randomly became conscious, then transhumanism logically follows. But what if there's something more inside us, a spark that no machine could ever replicate? Then this race, which began with a mummified body and images from the moon, might not lead us to the sky, but to the abyss. Everything we've talked about in this video might seem like a fanciful reconstruction to some people, believing that certain topics have never been of interest to the major powers and their strategic agencies that shape the fate of the world. After all, it's functional to what's happening on our planet right now. Because today, while we're talking about all this, someone is defining the ethical laws that will shape our future, the rules that define humanity and determine who qualifies as human. Most of us are not only unaware of it, but are excluded from it. And while we are busy with the most basic problems of our survival, someone else will decide for us which path humanity should take. At this point, we are really curious to know your opinion. Let us know in the comments what you think. And if you like the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it, because every interaction from you is a real way to support our work. See you in the next story.